Good evening, brothers. It's a pleasure to be back here with West Nashville Phoenix Lodge again. It's been a little while, but it's always fun, and I really like what this lodge has been doing and the energy that you guys have. So I'm thrilled to be asked to come back and talk to you. Let me get a couple of real quick housekeeping things out of the way before we get too deep into this. First off, I want to be sure to make this, sometimes I forget to do my disclaimer. But my standard disclaimer is, anything I say up here tonight's my opinion, not the opinion of any lodge or Grand Lodge. Heck, I don't even agree with myself, but about 75% of the time. So I could change my mind before this presentation's over and tell you to, scrap that, we're going to do something else. But we're speculative Masons, right? I'm going to do a little speculating tonight. The other thing is, if you like this talk, we're going to be doing or enjoy talks like this. If you have a good time tonight, come join us on October the 11th at our, 7th annual Symposium on Masonic Esoterica. We do it every October at the Grand Lodge building, except for the one year we did it here on video because we were all shut down for COVID. You'll have a suite of speakers running the entire day, starting from 9 a.m. and running until about 4 o'clock or later. Some of whom are in the room tonight. Carrick's going to be speaking there, Warren's going to be speaking there, and I think that's everybody that's here. But you'll see a lot of familiar faces there. If you're interested in doing that, like I said, if you like this, come see more. If you don't like this, come see better. You can go to middlechamber.org to register and buy your ticket. A ticket just covers the cost of lunch. We're not, it's like $25. So that's my plug for the evening. One other bit of housekeeping before I start really getting into the meat of it. Is there anyone here tonight, and it's okay, is there anyone here tonight who is not a Master Mason? Do we have any EAs or Fellowcrafts? Okay, great. Glad you're here. Thanks for coming. The only reason I ask is because I'll need to know whether or not to kind of curtail some lines of conversation so that it's appropriate for the audience is all. So I'm glad you're here. All right. So what I'm going to be talking about this evening is what I call the speculative roots of Freemasonry, or speculative Freemasonry's Rosicrucian roots. And I'm trying to answer this question, okay? I've been a Freemason for 30 years, and I have seen rivers of ink spilled trying to show that we are descendant from the Knights Templar or some other group. Most of the time with little or no data to back it up other than it sounds pretty cool. And it's a marketing thing, really. It makes us sound more legitimate than we are. Honestly, the most reasonably, rationally provable answer for where Freemasonry comes from is from the Operative Stonemasons Guild of the 16th and 17th centuries. And people will go to great lengths to prove that, and I think they probably have sufficiently proven that point. But the one thing that in all of these years that I've never seen adequately addressed or answered is, why? I mean, to what end? What caused these guys, the big poofy wig and pantyhose crowd with titles and money and education, guys that didn't have calluses on their hands because they never did an honest day's work in their life. What caused those guys to want to go join those guys? Anybody in here belong to a trade guild of any kind? No. Occasionally we'll have somebody that's a plumber, belongs to a carpenter's guild or something like that. And an electrician's guild. And every time I ask this question, if anybody in the audience says yes, when was the last time you saw a senator or a governor or a billionaire entrepreneur put in a petition to join your local electrician's guild? And everybody laughs. Well, they should laugh because it's kind of ridiculous, right? Why would these guys seek to join with these guys? And that's kind of the question that I'm trying to answer, and hope that you will agree that I've come up with at least a plausible answer for that. So let's get started. I've mentioned the Rosicrucians, and so I feel like I need to lay the groundwork. Who were they? What were they? Where do they come from? Some of you may already be familiar with some of this. In the early days of the 1600s, in the second decade of the 17th century, 3 documents hit the ground. In 1614, the Fama Fraternitatis, published in Kassel, Germany, anonymously. We don't know for sure any authorship on this, but I'll come back around to that in a minute. We actually kind of know who did it. It was published, like I said, in Kassel, Germany, and it's generally attributed to a group of guys who history's come to refer to as the Tübingen Circle. Tübingen was the name of the little village where they lived. They were almost all Lutheran ministers, okay? This is firmly part of, historically you've got the Protestant Reformation, right? Where Martin Luther nails his theses. It's important you pronounce that word correctly. He nails his theses on the church door. Some of you got that. You're my people. You're my people. The rest of you are scratching your head or just starting to get it. But so you had the Protestant Reformation, and then you have the Catholic response to that, the Counter-Reformation, and then you have the Protestant response to the Catholic response, which is usually referred to as the anti-Counter-Reformation, because we throw in double negatives there. This is very much an anti-Counter-Reformation or group of guys and a group of writings. The Fama lays out the story of the discovery by some members of a society called the Society of the Rose and Cross, and they unearth this hidden, hermetically sealed tomb, and in this tomb they find the remains of the founder of their order, who's been dead for 180 years or so, perfectly preserved, along with a bunch of other artifacts and so on. And it tells the story of Frater Christian Rosenkreuz, and his journeys through Europe and his foundation of the Rosicrucian order. That's basically the gist of the Fama. A year later, in a different tract, the Confessio Fraternitatis. So it's a very different document than the first one. This one is really kind of like a 17th century mission statement. It's like a list of points. These are the reasons for the existence of our order. This is what we believe in. This is what we do. Okay? These guys were bold. They did not shy away from controversy. This was 1615. This is right around the same time that Galileo is on trial for saying that the earth rotates around the sun instead of the other way around. And in the Confessio, they come flat out and say, the Pope is the Antichrist, in that many words. And you can't say that in 17th century Europe without a lot of boldness and a lot of consequences. I'm not saying I agree with it, but that was their stance. It was the anti-Counter-Reformation. And so these guys there's a reason they were writing this stuff anonymously at this point. So those are kind of the foundational documents. In these two, they laid out a plan. They laid out a mission. Like I said, the second one's a mission statement. And that mission was to heal the world, to change the world. In fact, members of the Rosicrucian fraternity, as they defined it here, are charged with performing a number of duties. And one of those duties, the first and foremost of those duties, is to heal the sick, and that gratis. Heal the sick at no charge. These guys were all, in addition to being Lutheran ministers and very much Reformation-minded, they were also practicing alchemists. In particular, they practiced alchemy in the vein of Paracelsus, who was, we think of alchemy as being entirely this process of turning lead into gold, but a lot of alchemy is nothing to do with that, either literally or figuratively. A lot of alchemy has to do with finding cures for sickness. You know, And that's Paracelsian alchemy. Paracelsus was primarily, first and foremost, a healer. He was a medicine worker, and he was looking for ways to cure illness. Hence, a practical application of heal the sick and that for free. But it's beyond that, because if you go back to the Fama in 1614, it wasn't published as a standalone document. It had a few other leaflets published in a booklet with it, the first of which was literally a story, and I'm going to have to summarize the title of basically a plan for healing the whole wide world and making it a better place for everybody to live in. That's a gross summarization, but the title's about as long as my arm, and that's essentially what it is. And in this kind of farcical story, all the gods of all the different mythology systems come together to debate how can we fix what's wrong with the heart of man and make this a better world. And so you've got like Thor who says, I know, I'll just kill them all with my hammer and we can start all over again. And one of the gods says, no, what we can do is we can just make a window in everybody's chest so that you can see another man's heart and know whether he's good and true or not. And Zeus is like, hey, it worked before, right? I already cut him in half once. Let me cut him in half again, and that'll separate them, and they can't communicate with each other as well, and they can't do all these awful things that they do. And so that kind of lays the groundwork for the Fama, right? You got this kind of farcical joke about fixing what's wrong with the world, and these guys come along after that with a very serious-minded, well, this is how we're going to do it. We're going to fix what's wrong with the world, and we want you to help. This was the message of the Fama and the Confessio. We're going to heal the world, and we need your help. So if you're a like-minded person, we want you to join in our brotherhood and help heal the world. They didn't leave a calling card. They didn't post a Facebook page. There was no phone number that you could call. They simply said, if you want to be part of this movement, if you want to heal the world and make it a better place for all men, just do the work. Do the work, and we'll notice. We'll find you, and we'll welcome you into our brotherhood. All right? No place to turn in a petition. Do the work, and we'll notice. It's the ultimate message of the Rosicrucian Brotherhood. And then they go on in 1616 and publish what's usually referred to as the third of the Rosicrucian manifestos, The Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz, which is very different from the first two. It's basically a short novel, and it details a 7-day journey in which the main character, Christian Rosenkreuz, who is presumably the same Christian Rosenkreuz whose tomb they found in the story of the Fama, as he's invited to the wedding of the king, right? And so it's this very spiritual journey, and the chemical wedding is a topic of presentation that we could do an entire series on and barely scratch the surface. It is both an alchemical text, it's a text about initiation, it's all internal, it's all about the union of the soul with God, not the union of the king and the queen, because that's just a facade for the whole. In fact, there's no wedding in the story. He goes to the wedding never happens. A bunch of people get their heads chopped off and they create a homunculus and they go through this grand alchemical process and stuff like that. But it kind of lays out it's a very alchemical story, although not the whole book is that way. On the topic of alchemy, in the Confessio, they actually come out and say that the alchemists of the day are all charlatans. They're all just faking it for money. They don't have a kind word to say about any alchemist unless their name is Paracelsus or John Dee. And we're going to come back to John Dee a little bit later. So even though they write this grand alchemical text, which makes it clear that these guys are not talking about converting lead into gold or base metal into gold or higher metal. They're talking about converting the base metal of our souls into its original form, which is union with God. In other words, they're talking about making the perfect ashlar out of the rough ashlar. Unlike the first two, we know exactly who wrote The Chemical Wedding, and it was this guy, Johann Valentin André. And we know that, or at least we can presume that, because he told us he wrote it. He admitted to it later in life. He was very young when he wrote this. And I believe, which is, we can talk about, if anybody wants to talk about this afterwards, that he wrote it when he was about 16 years old. So when I say very young, I mean very young. But his father was also a Lutheran minister, was also a practicing alchemist, had a laboratory at home, all of this stuff. And this was just a few years after the publication of St. Teresa of Avila's Interior Mansions, or Interior Castles, depending on what translation you're looking at. And I personally believe that this was intended, this being The Chemical Wedding, as a writing exercise that young Johann Valentin André did as a Protestant retort to Teresa's very Catholic approach to Gnosticism. Okay, that's an opinion that I have that I'm happy to talk with you about, but it's outside the scope of this. He was a member of that Tübingen circle that I mentioned before, so he theoretically had written this before that group formed, and then they got together, they did what they did, they published the stuff, and I think that they probably went back and tweaked as a group The Chemical Wedding that he had written 3 or 4 or 5 years earlier to the form that we have now. Like I said, he was, these works were intended as a rejection of both the original Protestant and Counter-Reformation, and a different approach to how we should organize our society along esoteric, spiritual, scientific lines. We tend to think in today's modern world of religion and science as being opposite forces that are constantly battling each other. Brothers, this is not true, and it should not be felt that that's the case. They're two different aspects of the human psyche, aspects of the human experience. These guys were looking to take that 16th century alchemy and apply rigor to it, to develop it into what we would think of today as a science. And they did, right? Because this is where we have this switch from calling it alchemy to calling it chemistry. So a lot of, like Paracelsus, for example, when I talked about earlier, when he's trying to heal the sick, he's practicing chemistry. It's just he's practicing it to the extent that the science of the day would allow him to understand, and using the words and the language that he had. So this is the group that I'm talking about, the Rosicrucians. The main thing I want you to take away from this is they were trying to fix the world and everything that was wrong with it. They were trying to change society to be more intellectual, more spiritual, to try to perfect the soul of the individual as well as the soul of the collective. And they did it by telling people, if you want to join with us, do the work and we will find you. Okay? That's the important takeaways that I want from all of this Rosicrucian stuff. Oh, so this is happening, I said, right, what, 1614, 15, 16, so the second decade of the 17th century. Well, oh, sorry, I forgot about this slide. One of the things that they referred to themselves as is the Invisible College. They called themselves the Society of the Rose and Cross, or the Society of Rosicrucians, or the Rosicrucian Brotherhood. There's a number of names, but they also refer to themselves as the Invisible College. And that comes back to kind of what I was saying before of you can't find us, we're invisible, right? We'll come and we'll find you. This is an etching that was done in 1618, just a couple years after all of these documents. And so you can see that this guy, Constantine's, I don't know who in the heck that is outside of this piece of work. I've seen this everywhere. He's not somebody that I think is particularly well-known or famous. I could be wrong. I am not an art historian. But the point of this is just to point out that when they cast that wide net, come join us, do the work, and we'll find you, a mania swept over continental Europe. All of the thinking men in Germany and England and France and beyond, all of continental Europe saw this tract, saw this. By the way, they were actually published in different languages. The Fama was published in German so that everybody could see it and kind of get this kind of cool story about the tomb that they found and create this mystique around it. Next year, when the Confessio comes out, it's written in Latin, okay? The only people who are going to be able to read Latin are the highly educated. They were really pushing this at an audience, right? They were targeting that by changing the language that they printed it. They wanted everybody to be able to read it, so you print it in Latin. I mean, everybody meaning not divided by national boundaries, but it was very much targeted at the educated and the wealthy. But a mania sweeps over. I mean, I'm talking Taylor Swift level mania takes over Europe. I mean, they could have made a mint if they'd have just gone on tour, right? And had a costume change every 10 minutes. Well, I'm falling flat tonight.
I hear you, brother.
But what I cannot do is overstate how big this upswell was. Everybody who considered themselves an intellectual, whether they were or not, everybody wanted to be part of this brotherhood. And so you get stuff like, all of this artwork that starts to crop up from some guy that has no association that I'm aware of with the Rosicrucian Brotherhood. And here's the part where Carrick's been over there nodding all through all of this, and here's the part where I'm going to step on his toes. I don't think the Rosicrucian Brotherhood ever existed at this point. There's no evidence that it did, other than they said it did. And they're not even consistent with themselves as far as the timing and so on goes. I think they knew that the best way to change the hearts of man was not to change the hearts of man, because you can't do that. I can't make you believe something that you don't believe. As soon as we put an organization around this thing, it goes off the rails. But I also think that they knew that if you dangle a carrot in front of people, do the work and we'll find you, that the work will get done. Because people striving for that carrot will move heaven and earth to get it. Even if they never get it, they'll keep striving, trying to get that carrot. I think their real strategy for changing the world was to trick people into changing the world. And it worked. Because 100 years later, we have the formation of the Grand Lodge of London and Westminster. Now, this is a slide I took directly out of the last talk that I did here, because it has some important information on it. On June 24th, St. John's Day, 1717, representatives from 4 different London lodges got together at the Goose and Gridiron. One of them was the Goose and Gridiron Lodge, Crown Ale House and Apple Tree Tavern, and the 4th lodge, Rummer and Grapes Tavern. What do you notice about all of these lodges? Don't be shy. What do they all have in common? They're all named after taverns. They're not just named after taverns, they're named after the taverns where they met. Okay? And they came together on St. John's Day to form a Grand Lodge. Only one of those 4 lodges was what we think of as a speculative lodge. The first 3 were either all or almost all operative stonemasons. Okay? Only 25% of the lodges that got together to form the first Grand Lodge were what we would recognize as speculative Masons. That's 1717. 6 years later, Anderson publishes his Book of Constitutions, the first governing document for the craft. And by 1723, 6 years later, the craft is almost entirely speculative. The nature of Freemasonry changed from guys chipping away at stones to guys chipping away at stones in 6 years. Because there were a few guys in here who were interested in chipping away at this stone. So my question is, where did those guys come from? And why did they come here with these other 3 lodges in order to make it happen? And that's kind of where we're trying to get to. Who were some of these guys? Okay, Elias Ashmole. Who here has ever heard of Elias Ashmole before? Okay. A few of you, good. What do we know about Elias Ashmole? You can read it here if you don't know. What do we know about him? Why is he important to our conversation? Elias Ashmole was the first that we have documented proof of speculative Mason made in England. He wrote in his diary that he became a Mason at such and such lodge. I can't remember which one. Did I have it on here? No. In 1646, 30 years after the publication of the Rosicrucian manifestos, Ashmole becomes a Mason, a speculative Mason in an operative lodge in England. Okay, that was 1646. So we've had 30 years of Rosicrucian mania sweeping continental Europe. 30 years of people getting tired of not catching that carrot, and some of them go off and form their own groups calling themselves Rosicrucians. Okay? So like, fine, if what I'm doing isn't enough, I'll form my own Rosicrucian group and maybe that'll get their attention. Okay? He was one of those guys. And in fact, in 1650, 4 years after becoming a Mason, and remember at this point, Freemasonry was 2 degrees, okay? 4 years after becoming a Mason, he publishes a text called Fasciculus Chemicus. This is the cover of Fasciculus Chemicus. This was an English translation of a bunch of alchemical texts that were originally written by John Dee, called together by John Dee's son, I believe it was his youngest son, Albert Dee. Albert, at the time, was working as the court physician in Russia, and he entered into a correspondence with Elias Ashmole on alchemical matters. And over the course of this correspondence, he shared with Elias Ashmole many of his father's notes and writings that had not previously been published because they were not intended for public consumption. They were private notes that he had kept to himself. So what does Ashmole do? Of course, he translates them into English and publishes them. Pissed Arthur off. Arthur got really fired up about this. But I guess you can say he got the last laugh, because if you look up this text now, they don't give Ashmole writing credits. So if you go to Amazon to buy it, Arthur Dee is listed as the author and Elias Ashmole is listed as the editor. Okay, so at least at some point they got their credits nailed down and got them corrected. But so he published this 4 years after becoming a Mason. Look at all the Masonic emblems and symbolism that we see in this. It's unbelievable. I don't know, will this work up there? No, it kind of disappears on the screen. But across the top, you've got the king on the left with the sun, the queen on the right with the moon, and in the middle, you've got Hermes holding the caduceus. Guys, I don't think I should have to get into too deep of the weeds to say that that's the sun and the moon and the master right there that we reference in our work. You've got all kinds of emblems and symbols, musical instruments, instruments of war. I don't know if you can see it up there, the little booklet on the left side, kind of halfway up, has got a series of numbers on it in a grid. That's the Pythagorean talisman, which if you have listened to Brother Tom Driver's talks about this, really unlocks the meaning of the 3, 5, and 7 steps and the secret word of a Master Mason, all embroiled in that. This is all just replete with Masonic emblems, not the least of which you may have not seen because they're kind of hard, they're covered up with a bunch of other stuff, is the fact that all of those emblems are laid over top of 2 columns. You guys see the columns behind all of that stuff now on the left and the right? So, this is very much, you can see the influence of his Masonic experience on this publication, which he made, like I said, 4 years after the fact. When this was published in 1650, this is exactly what it looked like. Later versions of this have a different version of this cover piece, which I don't have an image of up here, but with the scroll covering the face of that bust removed. And you can see who it is. And the authorship of this the name is written on the plinth there that the bust sits on. It's Mercuriophilus Anglicus, okay? The English mercuriophile, the English alchemist, okay, is what he's calling himself. Ashmole's name is not on this, okay? And there's a reason for that. And his face is covered up because in the version of this that came out later on, it was very clearly this guy's mug on that bust, right? But for reasons, he couldn't put his likeness or his name on this, okay? And I will also call your attention to that little symbol in the top left above the scroll there, which looks like the sun with the moon on its head and a cross. That's another representation of the sun, the moon, and the master, and it's an emblem that'll pop up again. Stick a pin in that in your brain. So this comes out in 1650. 10 years later, Ashmole co-founds with a bunch of other brothers who were part of this whole big early 17th century Rosicrucian mania and study of alchemy. They get together and they form the Royal Society. Bear that in mind. Another guy that crops up in this topic, Robert Moray. Now in 1641, now remember our dates, that's 5 years before Ashmole. In 1641, he became a speculative Freemason in Edinburgh, Scotland. He wasn't the first one there, but he was among the first ones. There was only a couple before him, and they're not of particularly direct interest to this line of conversation. But he and Ashmole were tight. They were buddies, and it's very probable, it's very likely that Ashmole sought out the Masonic Guild, the Freemasons Guild, after being influenced by his friend Robert Moray. And there were others all around the same time in the 1640s. These poofy wig and pantyhose types who were looking to join with each other, but for some unknown reason went to an operative stonemasons guild to do it. According to Gould's History of Freemasonry, Moray was, quote, a great patron of the Rosicrucians, an enthusiasm he shared with his brother Mason, Elias Ashmole. And I just put that in there in quote so that you don't think I'm making up this whole thing about Moray and Ashmole being buddies or them both being connected with the Rosicrucians, because they absolutely were. Okay, and like his buddy and fellow Mason and fellow Rosicrucian, because that's the way they wrote it, in 1660, he was another one of the co-founders of the Royal Society. So why did Ashmole have to cover his face? And why did these guys go looking? It's clear that what they wanted was to become united with this original Rosicrucian brotherhood. They were almost obsessed with it. One of the reasons why Ashmole went directly towards Dee, because Dee's one of the few guys that the Rosicrucians said he knows what he's talking about, so Ashmole goes straight to the source. Dee's dead by then. Okay, John Dee died in about 1605, but his son was alive, and that's how they established that connection. But what was going on that forced Elias Ashmole to cover up his face? So here's the historical context of the time. In 1642, 4 years before Ashmole becomes a Mason, a year after Moray had become a Mason, we have the English Civil War, in which the Cavaliers, which is the English Royal Loyalist faction, is being besieged by Oliver Cromwell and his puritanical Roundheads, okay? And so the mode, the tone of public life is starting to change and evolve in England as Cromwell's power and star is rising and as the war wages on. So much so that in 1645, Moray, along with some other prominent people, form, and Ashmole himself, the two of them, form a group called the Invisible College. And they start meeting in London because they have to do it in secret. This is why they call themselves the Invisible College. But there's no coincidence that they use the same exact name that the Rosicrucian Brotherhood had used in their text 30 years before. Again, they're calling back to that. They're the children of that movement trying to connect with that movement in any way that they possibly can. they're chasing that carrot, okay? But they had to do it in secret because Cromwell's star is rising and the tides are changing in England at the time. By a few years later, 1649, Cromwell controls enough of England that he overthrows the king and declares himself Lord Protector. Does anybody know what the most interesting thing is about King Charles I? What's the most interesting thing about King Charles I?
First example of regicide.
Yep, I have a little bit more colorful way of saying it that I steal from Monty Python, which is that the most interesting thing about about King Charles I is that he was 5 feet 6 inches tall at the start of his reign and only 4 foot 8 inches tall at the end of it. Because they lopped off his head. So they lopped off his head. They declare Cromwell Lord Protector. And all of this stuff has to go underground. It all has to go underground. So we went from this, this is kind of a painting of an event that would have taken place in the 1590s or so. This is during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, at which time the aforementioned John Dee, alchemist, mathematician, cartographer, conjurer, occultist, the list goes on and on. Any of you guys in here are really into maps? You like maps? You know the standard map that we all grew up with in school is called the Mercator projection. That's named after the guy that created it, whose last name is Mercator, and he and John Dee were roommates. John Dee actually helped him create that map. So this is a depiction of John Dee conjuring spirits in the court of Queen Elizabeth for her entertainment. This is 50 years before Oliver Cromwell takes over England. This kind of stuff is okay in late 16th and early 17th century England. Not so by around 1640, 1650. This is not an acceptable thing to do in a Christian country. So I touched on John Dee. Let's talk about him just a little bit more. He was a very famous 16th century cartographer, mathematician, astronomer, occultist, navigator, conjurer. I think I said most of those things. Okay? The manifestos, I've already said, refer back to him. Much has been written about John Dee. I talked about Rosicrucian. If Rosicrucian mania is kind of like the Eras Tour, this guy's Taylor Swift right here. I mean, everybody either wanted to be John Dee or study under John Dee or learn from what he had to leave. He was also a spy. He was, in fact, I showed you a picture of him conjuring for Queen Elizabeth. He was Queen Elizabeth's spy master, and in his travels around Europe, trying to impress the different crowned heads with his skills in alchemy and conjuring, was really doing a lot of spying on those courts. And when he did that, he would write his coded messages back to Queen Elizabeth, and they were stamped with his seal as the spy master of the crown, which was this symbol here in the bottom corner. That's right, folks. This was the Queen's spy master, and his symbol was 007. And if you think I'm making that up, I'm not. A lot of folks have suggested, although it was never directly confirmed, that Ian Fleming was referencing John Dee when he tagged James Bond with the appellation 007. Why 007, say you? Who? No, nobody's going to. Why 007? Because there's a biblical character who is the seventh in the line of succession from Adam, who is very revered by both the alchemists and therefore by proxy the Rosicrucians. So this is a reference to the seventh son of Adam. That seventh son of Adam was named Tubal-Cain. And that's literally the only time that name is mentioned in the Old Testament, in one verse where it talks about Tubal-Cain and his brothers and his sister and how his father killed someone. Way off topic to get off into the weeds on that one, but I wanted to point it out. So I mentioned to you that the Rosicrucian manifestos referred to him. I also mentioned to you that it was his notes as an alchemist that Elias Ashmole published in 1650. And in that, I said there's a symbol in the top corner that I wanted you to look at and notice, which was this symbol. And this is an emblem called the hieroglyphic monad, and this was the mark, if you will, that John Dee used when he wrote alchemical texts. This symbol 007, it actually had a multiple meaning, right? It was the seventh son from Adam, but it also told Queen Elizabeth that this was for your eyes only, and that's not a joke. That's really what it was. I could go on and on about Ashmole getting these letters from Albert D. from Russia with love. There's all kinds of Her Majesty's Secret Service gags in here, but I'm going to let that slide. The other interesting thing, and this is one of the things that I think led to what the question we're trying to answer here really, at the crux of it, was this. In 1555, John Dee joined an operative guild for a trade that he was not a practitioner of. Right? He joined the Worshipful Society of Mercers. Hear that again, the Worshipful Society of Mercers in 1555. That's a merchant's guild. It's people who sell things, a number of things. It doesn't have to be. His father was a member of that guild because he was a trader in textiles. Okay, and so by right of patrimony, since his father was a member, he, John Dee, was allowed to join this operative trade guild, even though he himself was not a merchant, didn't practice that trade. I see the influence of, hey, we need to go underground. We've already seen that these guys look back to Dee for everything from their alchemical writings to their symbolism to their names, etc. It's, the names that they call themselves in hiding. I don't think it's a far stretch to say if he went and joined this operative guild, maybe we can too. Okay. And then there's this, and I'm not going to get too much in detail on this for a couple of different reasons. Among the early Rosicrucians, and I tend to want to put that in quotations because I'm not talking about the Tübingen Circle guys here. I'm not talking about Andre and his buddies that wrote those 3 manifestos. I'm talking about the guys that came after them that wanted to be Rosicrucians. They formed themselves into groups and sometimes called themselves Rosicrucians even though they weren't necessarily connected to those guys. But they had their own little legend, their own little story that they used to convey lessons to their new initiates. And one of those was a legend involving a character from the Old Testament named Hiram Abiff. And in this version of the story of Hiram Abiff, which is not in the Bible, it is unique to these guys. The Queen of Sheba comes to visit Solomon at the temple while the temple's being built. And without getting too much into detail about it, and here's where I'm going to give a plug, because I am going to get into detail about it at the October Scottish Rite Stated meeting. So this will be the topic of discussion or the presentation, just this slide in October. So if you're a member of the Nashville Valley or any other valley, come join us at Scottish Rite and you'll hear a little bit more about this. But over the course of the story of what happens at Solomon's temple during its building, the Queen of Sheba comes, and over the course of things, Hiram is nearly killed. He's nearly killed. But right before he would succumb to death, he is whisked away to the underworld where he meets this guy, this big demonic dude here. And the big demonic dude says to him, "I am thy father. I am Tubal-Cain." And he teaches Hiram Abiff a magic sigil that will stop the thing that's about to kill him. sends him back. And so he basically reveals that Hiram is a descendant in the line of Tubal-Cain and so on. Now, this is relevant to the Rosicrucians and the alchemists because Tubal-Cain is equivalent to Vulcan, the god of the forge, and therefore very, very important to people who are interested in the study of metals. All right? So just another thing that connects. Remember, what I'm trying to tell you about is these guys like Ashmole and Moray, these speculative guys who sought to join an operative guild that they weren't members of, who had this underground society studying alchemy and the occult, but had to hide it. They bring in references and names and connections that go back to the Rosicrucians and even further back to John Dee. Albert Pike says it's those guys, and he lists them by name, Ashmole and Moray by name. It's those guys to whom we owe the creation of the third degree. Most of what's in the third degree, although it's evolved over time, but large swaths of the third degree in particular, can be traced back to symbolism and stories and emblems practiced by this post-manifesto Rosicrucian groups that popped up as part of that mania. And most of it channels its way into Freemasonry through guys like Ashmole and Moray, or specifically those guys and others like them. So if this was England in 1640 to 1650, a country at war, I showed you in a previous slide what England looked like in the late 1500s when John Dee's conjuring in front of the Queen. Then 40, 50 years later, we had the English Civil War, and then England under Cromwell becomes this. A puritanical, very oppressive state where that kind of study is not allowed. And so as a result, the Lord Protector forces guys like Ashmole and Moray and other like-minded individuals trying to reach out for that Rosicrucian carrot, forces them underground. But that doesn't last. In 1660, after Cromwell died and his son, they attempted to pass the rule of the Protectorate onto his son. That was a disaster. It lasted for like 3 months, maybe 6, before they said, get them out of here. Hey, Charles, I know we cut your father's head off, but would you come back? So they reestablished a monarchy under Charles II. And within like days, weeks at most, I mean, it's just like the first order of business. All of those guys that founded the Invisible College founded a different group called the Royal Society under the warrant of the Crown, because they don't have to hide anymore. They don't have to hide anymore. And when that happens, England changes from this to this. A bunch of intelligent guys studying science, studying the nature of life, the relationship of man to his creator, and trying to make a better world. And out of that comes what we refer to as the Enlightenment. I can't put it any more concisely than this, and I think this sums the whole thing up. Christopher McIntosh, great author who writes a lot of stuff about Rosicrucians and the Rosicrucian documents that I mentioned before, he said Rosicrucianism was the dream. Freemasonry was the implementation. I want to be clear about what I'm saying, what I'm not saying. I am not saying that Freemasonry came out of the Rosicrucians directly, not in the sense that most people think. A lot of people want to say that, like I said, the Knights Templar evolved into the Freemasons. I'm not saying that the Rosicrucians evolved into the Freemasons, but what I am saying is that the movement of Rosicrucianism, the ideology behind them, inspired the men of that day to form and create organizationally what became the fraternity that we know today. It's kind of the difference between, I like to call it the operative history of an organization and the speculative history of the organization. The operative meaning we can trace a direct lineage, historical fact. This guy did this, and that guy did this, and that guy did this. To the speculative, it's more influence and latching on to the ideas and the ideologies and so on. So I guess to sum it up, I would say, in my opinion, and I hope I've made a decent case of it tonight, in my opinion, the reason why the big poofy chalked wig crowd knocked at the doors of a bunch of guys who worked for a living was to find a safe place to practice their version of Rosicrucianism, which involved alchemy, other occult, it's a word we need to stop being afraid of, studies. But they were forced to do that in secret because of the political ideas and pendulum at the time had swung against them. And they did that long enough that it took root and it started to change the nature of the fraternity. So much so that by the time, slowly, gradually, right? Gradually, because it took 60 years, 60 plus years to get from Ashmole joining the lodge in England to that meeting at the Goose and Gridiron. But it only took 6 to completely change the nature of the fraternity, to incorporate the ideas that Ashmole and his friends brought to the lodges.